Hey fam. I usually have a more direct thesis when I script a video, but Echoes of Wisdom left me so thoroughly satisfied, I just wanted to gush about it for a bit. That, and after my last few videos, I kind of want to affirm that this isn't strictly a hot take channel, so I figured I'd try something different. Well, I say different, but I've done gushing abouts before, so maybe if people enjoy this, then it can be a new recurring format. Definitely leave a comment letting me know if you want to see more of these before you leave. And just a quick note before we get started, there will be full spoilers here, so if you haven't finished the game yet and intend to play it, then definitely bookmark this and come back later for your own good. This is your warning. Now, I am notoriously one of the people who didn't love Tears of the Kingdom, despite adoring Breath of the Wild. I have a whole video on why that is for anyone who's curious and hasn't seen it yet, but I'm very happy to say that I very much enjoyed Echoes of Wisdom in a similar fashion to the way I did Breath of the Wild. It has easily catapulted itself to one of my new favorite top-down Zelda experiences, and while I initially wanted to let the hype die down a bit before coming to that conclusion, especially since Zelda games tend to benefit from new hotness syndrome more than most franchises, I feel quite certain that these feelings aren't going to suddenly burn out in a few months' time. This is because Echoes of Wisdom, in my opinion, basically did for top-down Zelda what I feel Breath of the Wild did for 3D Zelda. It brought exciting, innovative new structure and mechanics while still maintaining a bevy of classic Zelda staples and traditions, just loosely disguised as other things. Right from the very beginning, the Prologue had me hooked. As far as I can recall, this is basically the very first Zelda game to invoke one of my favorite gaming tropes, that being a taste of power intro. I'm not even sure I could quantify why, but Link just feels amazing to control here, and he also feels decidedly more powerful than he usually does even by a typical Zelda endgame, in my opinion. The thing about Link in most incarnations is that, unlike characters like Samus Aran, even once he's fully geared up, he never really ends his adventures feeling like an absolute killing machine. Between having powerful adversaries that he needs to get up close and personal with, armored foes that even the Master Sword can't penetrate, and limited ammunition and magic for his projectile weapons, Link always has to try. I don't even mean to imply that this is a bad thing, but Echoes of Wisdom's Prologue Link actually feels like a killing machine. A powerful sword that charges its spin attack in the blink of an eye, a bow that can charge its arrows into an energy-filled three-pronged shot, and bombs that can be charged into bomb chews, to say nothing of the fact that Link has infinite arrows and bombs and complete spammability with his rate of fire as well. This is highly unusual for Zelda games. A Link Between Worlds notably gave Link infinite ammunition, but balanced it out with a stamina meter which prevented spamming, and even depleted upon use of non-ammunition based items. Four Swords Adventures gave Link infinite ammo as well, and even allowed players to spam their items, but this was a concession for the fact that each human player could only hold one special item at a time. There was no proper inventory in that game. Tears of the Kingdom sort of half-committed to a taste of power opening, but although it started the player off with maxed out hearts and stamina and a fully powered Master Sword, it didn't really give you much to do with those tools, aside from swat a few bats away here and there. Echoes of Wisdom, by contrast, gives you a whole mini-gauntlet and an honest-to-goodness Ganon boss fight. This is some Symphony of the Night level shit, and I am so here for it. Bonus points for Link's inherent jump having a flip and being higher than Zelda's, as well as the return of his new hood from the Switch duology. Honestly, I really hope this thing is here to stay as a new Zelda tradition, even if just as an optional cosmetic accessory. And just putting it over his traditional green garb is the perfect middle ground between old and new for me. Like, as much as I like the Champion's Tunic, and oh boy, do I like the Champion's Tunic, I'd never wanted to permanently replace Link's perpetually cosplaying as a gnome because he was designed in the 80s. But throw that fashionable hood over the green, and we've got some modern flair overlaying the gnome costume, and it is just mwah, chef's kiss. The story also ended up really impressing me by Zelda standards. I mean, it was still very simple, but it was one of the more well-executed Zelda narratives, in my opinion, especially when looking at the most recent entries. A simple story executed well can go a long way, and that's exactly what we have here. For the first act, Link rescues Zelda, only to fall victim to a new threat himself. This new threat is able to swallow people up and produce indistinguishable evil doppelgangers of them. This happens to the King of Hyrule, who tries to actually have Zelda executed. Oh my god! Zelda breaks out of the castle dungeon with a little help from Impa and a lot of help from Tri, and since she's now a fugitive, she has to don a disguise, which ends up including Link's hood from the prologue, creating a nice visual through line connecting the two characters. While in this fugitive state, Zelda arrives at Link's home village, and we learn that this incarnation of Link is actually mute for a specific supernatural reason. Neat! Zelda then begins fighting back against the rifts which are swallowing Hyrule, starting with the Gerudo and Zora communities, which I am by no means the first person to say this, but it is so fucking cool to finally see the River and Sea Zora together in one title after all this time. This is literally historic. As a side note, I was also so stoked on the return of the Deku Scrubs. These guys are constantly getting shafted from newer releases, and they're a personal favorite Zelda race of mine, thanks in no small part to Majora's Mask. Special shout out to the scrub who basically flat out admitted that he values cotton candy over his friends' lives. I have never laughed so hard at a joke in a Zelda game. Again, literally historic. Anyway, getting back into it, during this first act, we also discover that Link has an evil doppelganger of his own, but across two different battles, Zelda eventually recovers his sword and bow. Once these two major rifts are repaired, the one at Hyrule Castletown expands, prompting her to return home and fix it. This involves Zelda having her own fight with Ganon. Once again, literally historic, and we discover that this Ganon has been an Echo all along, serving some greater threat. Ganon has always been the man behind the curtain, never the man in front of it. So once again, say it with me, literally historic. This victory then takes us into the story's second act, but not before the real Link shows up to save Zelda from said man behind the curtain at the cost of getting captured himself. With the true King of Hyrule now restored, Zelda ceases to be a fugitive, allowing her to shed her disguise and don a new outfit, providing the player with a nice little visual indicator of their story progress, since this is the turning point in the story which would normally be punctuated by something like Link acquiring the Master Sword. Anyway, from here, Zelda is tasked with closing 3 new rifts, which take her to the Gorons, where she recovers Link's bombs, the Deku Scrubs, and the mountains, where we meet what I have to assume is an homage to the Yeti couple from Twilight Princess. These tasks award Zelda with the 3 Goddess Sanctions, which, in typical Zelda tradition, we discover the villain actually wanted her to do the dirty work of collecting. This is because he's able to then make an echo of Zelda with the sanctions in her possession in order to reach the Triforce, which we are calling the Prime Energy this time for some reason. Evil Echo Zelda does beat the real Zelda to the Triforce's resting place, but the Triforce is split amongst the Echo, the real Zelda, and Link my boy. Zelda and Link team up for the finale, it's epic, cue heartfelt goodbye with Tri, cue gag of everyone's surprise at Link actually speaking, roll credits. Now, the reason I summed all of that up was to juxtapose it with some other recent-ish Zelda titles, especially other top-down ones. Although I absolutely adored A Link Between Worlds, for example, it never fully overtook my longtime personal favorite top-down entry, that being Minish Cap. This is because a simple but solid narrative goes a long way for me. Between Minish Cap and A Link Between Worlds, I think that Worlds is the better game overall, and I find it considerably more fun to play on a moment-to-moment basis, but I find Minish Cap to be the more compelling experience, because it uses its linearity to its advantage, narratively, while still offering the usual amount of Zelda side exploration. The small twists, turns, and changing objectives of the narrative keep things moving along nicely and keep me invested on repeat playthroughs. A Link Between Worlds, by contrast, really suffered narratively for its dedication to open design. Not much really happens between the prologue and the credits. Link meets the modern sages very briefly in very uncompelling micro-scenarios, and then Yuga kidnaps both them and Zelda. The mid-game sequence where you obtain the Master Sword, confront Yuga, and then follow him into Lorule for the first time is very cool, but then once you're in Lorule, basically nothing happens until the finale. And the funny thing is, that finale happens to be exceptionally memorable and well executed. In fact, it's probably still my favorite finale among the top-down Zeldas, but it's still just an exceptionally strong bookend at the end of the day. A Link Between Worlds in general has a bizarrely strong bookend narrative, but it's still a bookend narrative. Echoes of Wisdom, by contrast, proved that you can have the mostly open design and still have a compelling narrative. The mini-scenarios in each race's settlements were among the best in the series among the top-down entries, in my opinion. In fact, I felt that the handling of the various races of Hyrule in general was the strongest it's ever been among the top-down entries, just for the sheer number included and the level of detail in their communities. It's easy to forget this, but top-down Zelda in particular has been extremely inconsistent with regard to which races actually make an appearance. And even when a particular race does cameo, they often have extremely underbaked settlements. A Link Between Worlds, as a point of comparison again, had the sole architectural dwelling of the Zora be the Zora Queen's throne room, and the Gorons didn't make an appearance at all. Minish Cap had a few Gorons scattered about the overworld in isolation, but they didn't have a proper settlement, and in that game, the Zora didn't appear at all. And while the Gerudo Desert is no stranger to top-down Zelda, the Gerudo themselves haven't appeared in a top-down entry since their extremely underbaked top-down debut in Four Swords Adventures, with the Sea Zora only making their second appearance within this subset of entries as well, having last appeared even further back in the Oracle games on the Game Boy Color. Now, obviously, Hylian race representation is by no means a prerequisite for a good Zelda game, but for me personally, they always elevate the experience of whichever games they're properly featured in. The Races of Hyrule remain extremely unique within the realm of high fantasy, and so I always extra enjoy the incarnations of Hyrule which are well populated with them as a result. They just really liven up and enrich the game world, I feel. I also felt that the side quests were much stronger than usual, partially because of their presentation, and partially because I felt that the rewards were more exciting than the typical heart pieces and rupee rewards that other Zelda games sort of force you to contend with just because Link doesn't have 50 zillion progression items, and they have to save the handful he does have for the major dungeons. And while the minigames associated with some of them varied in quality, I still engaged with them more than I usually do in other entries for this same reason. And speaking of which, let's talk about the actual gameplay, finally. First of all, I completely understand why a Zelda purist wouldn't be into it. I've been seeing a lot of discussion online from people who enjoy it and people who don't, and frankly, it's all extremely valid. But I'm in the camp that really likes it, and here's why. First of all, if you've seen my Castlevania videos, then you'll know that I'm a total whore for alt character modes in games, where the core world and design are kept, but you're given the reins of a different character who handles substantially differently. Echoes of Wisdom is essentially that principle applied to a Zelda game. This is classic Zelda through and through, but you play as Zelda, and she just doesn't have Link's equipment and abilities, barring her extremely limited-use sword fighter form. Instead, she has a metric butt-ton of echoes, ranging from inanimate objects to animate objects to monster minions. You receive new echoes at such a steady clip that as long as you're on board with the concept, which clearly I am, there's always some fun new active use reward to look forward to. The existence of rare monsters in particular had me exploring so much more thoroughly than I often do in these games. And the execution of rarity was perfect. It's not that anything has an obnoxiously low spawn rate or anything like that. Rare monsters are simply monsters that only appear in one specific location in the game world. Sometimes they're even full-on optional bosses, and sometimes they're high-level echoes. Honestly, I preferred the latter, but I could see many players preferring the former. And they're almost always in locations that make sense, located by conspicuous landmarks, or within optional dungeons with conspicuous entryways. In other words, they're rewards for exploring off the beaten path, but also for following your natural curiosity. They're not hidden behind cryptic, arbitrary bullshit that you'd need a guide to locate or figure out. And while the ecosystem definitely isn't what I would have envisioned for Zelda's first proper playable solo outing, I always imagined she would make use of more Smash Bros-esque goddess magic, I absolutely fell in love with it. The echoes, to me, kind of bridge the gap between typical progression items and the Switch Duology's toolbox-style powers. On top of that, they have the addictive, feel-good-to-collect quality of, like, the Monster Souls in Castlevania Aria and Dawn of Sorrow, but without the headache-inducing microscopic drop rates. Obviously, they're not all equally worthwhile to use, and some of the monster echoes are either simple element swaps or direct upgrades that essentially just invalidate the previous models, but there's like a billion of them, so who cares? The Master Sword is mechanically just a direct upgrade to Link's starting sword anyway, and nobody ever complains about that. The aspects of linearity that do exist within Echoes of Wisdom ensure that the average player will just about always acquire these monster variants in order from weakest to strongest, if nothing else. So if you enjoy using a particular monster, you'll generally make use of all three levels of it throughout your playthrough. Just think of these as Echoes of Wisdom's analog to Link's sword upgrades. I also love the Bond and Reverse Bond ability. Not much to say about this really, it's just fun, flexible, Switch Duology-style toolbox shit that combos with Echoes in really interesting ways, and it super works for me. Regarding Sword Fighter form, in the earlier hours of the game, I was slightly annoyed with the fact that your Sword Fighter energy doesn't auto-charge over time at all, but I eventually came to realize that if it did self-charge, then most players would probably over-rely on it, which would be really antithetical to what the game is trying to accomplish, so ultimately I came away agreeing with this design decision. I generally only used it to smack bosses during their vulnerability periods, or to occasionally get myself out of a pinch if I was being swarmed, and I was perfectly happy with this balance. Now, I have seen the argument that Echoes make the combat into a sort of slower, less direct version of itself, like you're basically just adding a less efficient middleman into every encounter. To be honest, I can't really argue with this, but I still found the combat to be highly engaging simply because I got really into the vibe of this summoner role. While some monsters will definitely be your go-tos, I found that there was enough nuance to the strengths and weaknesses of each to warrant switching them up fairly frequently, and actually applying some thought to who I summoned, even during the endgame. Some monsters are tanky and hit hard, but can't hit aerial foes at all. Some are swift, but easily blocked or interrupted by enemies with shields. Some even work especially well together. The Ribbitoon, for example, is a support monster, which combos nicely with all of the electric monsters. My point is that while I acknowledge the validity of the criticisms that Echoes combat has received, I personally feel it's an element of the game that becomes more rewarding the more creatively you engage with it. I also happen to love mage and summoner archetypes to begin with, so I got a lot of intrinsic enjoyment out of just getting into that role. Sure, sometimes it's nice to just bludgeon your enemies to death, but most Zelda games let me do that. I've had that experience plenty of times, and I'm sure I'll have it plenty more in the future. In the meantime, I personally loved Zelda's somewhat more cerebral and indirect approach to dispatching her enemies. Additionally, as I kind of hinted at when discussing side quests, I love the breadth of worthwhile upgrades to Zelda's kit, even outside of the Echoes themselves. Outfits and accessories made a welcome, if somewhat stripped-down return, and while some of them were too circumstantial to ever really be worth equipping, some of them were practically must-haves. I never took the frog ring off once I acquired it, as it even changed the way I interacted with my Echoes. In particular, before the Frog Ring, I generally ascended sheer vertical cliffs by reverse bonding to a Crawltula, since plat booms were an awkward height that Zelda couldn't mount in a single bound, but often took off before I could conjure up a trampoline. Once Zelda's jump was higher, I was able to permanently upgrade to my cycloptic yellow elevator friend for vertical ascension. As a side note, I was initially concerned that bed bridges were going to remain overly prevalent throughout my playthrough, but was pleased to discover that I outgrew the need for them very quickly. Between water blocks, flying tiles, strantulas, cloud platforms, and probably other echoes I'm not even thinking of right now, the player can largely retire their bed echoes well before the end of the story's first act, if they so desire. Anyway, I also enjoyed the fact that between the price of accessories found in shops and the Great Fairy in this game increasing your number of accessory slots for ever-increasing fees, I always had a use for my rupees. Smoothies were also a nice middle ground between traditional Zelda potions and the cooking system from the Switch duology. Honestly, I'm not even sure why they included potions at all when smoothies are so much more effective and way cheaper. Horseback riding made its top-down Zelda debut, barring that one stage in Four Swords Adventures, and even the sparkly key items became exciting quest rewards once I realized that they were essentially ingredients for automatons. The overworld itself is also in strong contention for my personal favorite overworld in all of top-down Zelda, both for its scope and its density. It's a very good size, while also being packed to the gills with something of interest around every corner. Honestly, I thought the addition of horseback riding was almost wasted on it, since there's so little unused space. Finally, let's talk dungeons. Again, not really much to say, and pretty much entirely stuff that's been said before by many others on this platform, but overall I felt they were extremely well executed. Echoes of Wisdom is proof positive that you can indeed have traditional Zelda dungeons in a more open-ended toolbox-style title. Everything from the aesthetics, to the small keys, to the mini-bosses, to the big keys and final bosses were present and accounted for. Some of them even offer a new echo or three, a la the series' traditional dungeon items. Interestingly, for better and worse, I actually found the water dungeon to be the simplest one this time around, thanks to its rather basic hub and spoke structure. You know what I'm gonna say, right? About the water dungeon being the simplest one? Literally historic. So now I'm going to talk critiques because I can't help myself, but honestly, most of these really didn't bother me or detract from the experience in any meaningful way. I'm also going to divide these into actual critiques and then personal nitpicks, starting with the critiques. By far the game's biggest issue, however, is this very first thing, and once again, I'm far from the first person to bring this up. Nintendo, in their infinite hubris, have still not figured out one of the most obvious quality of life features that these newer Zelda games desperately need: a tweak to the item selection UI. This is by far the game's most egregious flaw to me, by an enormous margin. With over 100 of these echoes, a single horizontal quick select bar simply does not cut it. Aonuma, it is 2024, what the fuck? There are so many obvious as hell solutions to this that it physically hurts me that you couldn't figure any of them out. Option 1. Why isn't there so much as a favorites list? Down on the D-pad doesn't have anything mapped to it. Make it a fucking favorites list, patch that shit in yesterday. Option 2. At least divide the quick select's long horizontal list into a few rows. Maybe one for inanimate objects, one for land monsters, one for sea monsters, one for flying monsters. Jesus Christ, something! Option 3. Por que no los dos? Just do both of these things. You're the fucking genius millionaire game designer, you shithead. I'm sorry, this is such an obvious fix, and it's a huge pet peeve of mine when everyone and their wet dog can conjure up a solution to a problem that a brilliant, prolific gaming legend somehow hasn't even noticed for 2 entries in a row. Anyway, this next thing actually doesn't bother me at all, but I can definitely see it bothering a lot of other players. While the dungeons in this game are fundamentally traditional Zelda dungeons, and I personally have nothing but positive feelings towards them, I did notice that they were pretty lacking in macro-level puzzle box-style design. The vast majority of puzzles found within them were localized to single rooms, without much macro-level thinking. So generally speaking, you might get stuck on an individual room puzzle, but as long as you visit every room in the dungeon, you will unquestionably complete the thing with minimal issue. I'd say this is a concession for the lack of traditional progression item withholding, but A Link Between Worlds had players enter each dungeon with its associated item right out of the gate, and had to design each dungeon around that single item and no others, and yet somehow managed to have some of the most complex and cerebral dungeons in the entire series. So this is definitely an area I think Echoes of Wisdom could have done better in, for the sake of those it matters to. Speaking of the dungeons, this next thing is easily my biggest complaint after the UI thing. There's kind of no proper final dungeon. There's a final gauntlet, but most top-down Zeldas have a proper finale dungeon that the final boss waits at the end of. Even when it's on the shorter side, it's still generally a dungeon, not just a corridor of enemy encounters. The final gauntlet in Echoes does technically have a couple of simple puzzle rooms thrown in, but they're among the simplest in the game. Basically, you'd better enjoy the third dungeon you do in the final set of 3, because there is no finale dungeon waiting for you. And speaking of the finale, Null is, let's just say he's not going to be winning any awards for fan favorite one-off villain. He isn't a Skull Kid, a Girahim, or even a Yuga. He's more of a Bellum, a big, generic-looking blob with no real personality. While I complimented the game earlier for making the historic move of making Ganon the frontman for someone else for the first time, it's kind of a shame that he was the opening act for what is essentially a big, stupid haze monster with an even more generic and one-dimensional goal and personality than Ganon himself. I get that they wanted Null to look like a big demonic version of Tri, but if this was the result, then it just wasn't worth it, in my opinion. This game was amazing, and deserved a better final antagonist. And this kind of extends to the final battle itself as well, actually. Since they were going for the Link team-up angle, I understand that they wanted it to have a substantial action component, but I felt that it would have majorly benefited from some sort of more puzzle-oriented solo phase as well, since that's where this game is at its strongest. Zelda does get separated from Link for one phase of the fight, but it's just to do a side-scrolling swimming section. As things stand, the final battle is certainly exciting, but it basically just amounted to a bullet hell sequence where I summoned a Lionel to assist Link with DPS and then just focused on dodging attacks. I still enjoyed it for what it was, but the best in the series it was not. From here on out, though, we're into sheer nitpick territory, and the first of these is easily the pettiest. Basically, they did the hood thing again. Zelda has a model with the hood down, but the player cannot access it at will. Zelda only pulls the hood down during 2 very specific sequences, and this time you can't even do an arduous sequence of shitty mundane side quests to unlock the ability to lower it yourself. Personally, I think Zelda's initial adventuring outfit is a lot cooler looking than the sporty, outdoorsy version of her traditional attire that she gets for the second act, and pulling the hood down was all the devs really needed to do to provide this same second act visual change, indicating Zelda's shedding of her fugitive status, but whatever, you can only re-equip this initial outfit with the hood up. I know this is incredibly stupid, but honestly, it bothered me more than some of the actual critiques. Anyway, this next thing is another one that didn't really bother me per se, but it's kind of a weird design choice, and I could see it mildly irking other people. So the finale does this thing where it basically renders one of your upgrades a complete waste of resources, that being one of your sword fighter enhancements. When Zelda gives Link's equipment back to him, she loses the ability to enter sword fighter form. This makes complete sense, ludo-narratively, but while I believe Link inherits all of the weapon upgrades you've obtained until that point, any might crystals you dumped into the energy gauge are basically a wasted resource, and it just feels weird to lose a core ability during a game finale, especially one you've actually dumped resources into. And finally, this last thing is weirdly kind of a compliment mixed with a nitpick. Basically, I really loved the concept of the automatons that Dampé can make for you. I love the way you get them, I love that they're mechanically distinct both from echoes in general and from the way their equivalent echoes function, and I even love their pun names. But I feel like they get seriously overshadowed by the echoes because of sheer feature bloat. Like, they're not technically redundant because they operate a bit differently and do things that no individual echo does, but in practice they end up feeling redundant because they can break. So like, why use one when you can just resummon an already absurd variety of echoes at no cost? Even as someone who was always enthusiastic about obtaining new automatons, I usually forgot I even had them during general gameplay, and I can't imagine I'm the only person this happened to. The automatons seem to me like a mechanic that should have been cut from this title and then added into the next top-down Zelda game starring Link, as kind of an homage to Echoes of Wisdom and a way to incorporate a quote-unquote echo of this title's core mechanic in a way which ludonarratively jives with Link as the protagonist. In other words, I think it's a great, really cool mechanic that is completely wasted within a game that simply does not need it at all. And I really hope that automatons do come back in Link's next top-down outing so that they can actually shine the way they deserve to. But that's pretty much it, guys. I absolutely loved Echoes of Wisdom, and given how densely packed it is with secrets to find and features to enjoy, I'm certain that there were at least a couple of things I forgot to mention here. If Nintendo ever decided to make a proper sequel to it, then I would be 100% on board. But if they decided to leave it as a standalone title, I think I would be okay with that too. At the end of the day, it's a game that I was sad to see end, because I just sort of wanted to spend more time with it. And frankly, that's kind of the highest compliment one can give a game, I think, regardless of any flaws or shortcomings it may have. I'm a passionate, lifelong classic Zelda fan, but I also have a deep appreciation for these more experimental titles, because the old standbys will always be there to return to. And Echoes of Wisdom has instantly become a standby for me. I look forward to replaying it soon. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. If you stuck around all the way until the end, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed what you saw, then please leave a comment letting me know if you'd like to see more of these gushing format videos. If enough people do, then I'll definitely make them a more regular thing. Also, if you're one of the people who didn't really enjoy Echoes of Wisdom, I'm curious as to why. I don't mean that in a leading or facetious sort of way, I'm genuinely curious. What would you have liked to see the developers do differently? Were you expecting Zelda to play as less of a summoner and more of a sorcerer? Were you anticipating her adventure to more closely resemble one of Link's traditional outings, just with progression magic in lieu of progression items? Were you anticipating her adventure to less closely resemble one of Link's in terms of structure and moment-to-moment gameplay? Would you have preferred Zelda's first game to be more of a kingdom management simulator type deal? I'd love to hear it, so feel free to leave a comment about it if you're inclined to share. Regardless, I hope you have an awesome day. Peace out.
Hail, Summoner. Conjure me up a warm bed, would you?